Hello friends and students. Today in this video we will look at the different categories of human rights and the contradictions that they present amongst each other. I will begin with quoting Eleanor Roosevelt, who in the Great Question delivered at the United Nations in New York on March 27, 1958 said, "Where after all do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world, yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, the farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and the child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have meaning anywhere. Human rights are rights and freedoms to which all humans are entitled to." Proponents of this concept usually assert that everyone is endowed with certain entitlements merely by the reason of being a human being. What exactly does rights do? Rights give expressions to how all humans can participate fully in a civil society. Civil society provides a critical foundation for holding governments accountable, ensuring good governance and promoting all human rights, including economic, social and cultural rights. Citizens, activists, organizations, congregations, writers, journalists and reporters, each one of them play a vital role in encouraging governments to respect human rights and thus maintaining a healthy, vibrant society. Firstly, participating in civil society is the idealized norm against which a society may be measured as expression of civil values that operate within any society. Rights are derived from the amalgamation of religious, philosophical and legal principles that address social justice. This social justice has to be understood in the context of a worldwide struggle to combat oppression and inequity. Secondly, rights cannot be thought of in isolation from humans. They are part of an integrated vision of what it means to participate in diverse human experiences. These run from the most basic interaction with the environment to the ways in which people live day-to-day life, to a catastrophic event like war, genocide or even pandemics like what we are undergoing now. Thirdly, rights affect local and intimate human relationship and the global relations that govern the way human capital and energy are exchanged, manipulated and exploited. Fourthly, rights typically involves freedom that makes human seem individually oriented, but they also address the duties and responsibilities that make these freedoms more than a simplistic expression of individuals' self-interest. Finding an appropriate balance between the individual self-interest and the broader civic communitarian interest is the crucial problem at the heart of most human rights issues. Human rights have two opposing viewpoints, which I will just discuss here. The first viewpoint is that human rights are universal, they are absolute moral structures that underlies all forms of human culture and civic organizations from which no one is exempted. In this universal view, there is an unalterable inherent quality of being human that confers unchangeable and seemingly fundamental rights on a person. These rights invalidate the rights of a state to impose legal codes that may breach the principles of universal right. Therefore, universality is based on the fundamental respect for differential beings and is not to be confused with the uniformity or plurality, which means all humans share universal right based on respect for life, which in turn involves respect for the diversity of life. The second view advances a more relative, fluid conception of rights. It holds that the meaning of a right changes from context to context and from culture to culture. It also makes it possible that similar changes are deemed important to achieve a just and equitable recognition of all humanity. The right theorist tends to see that these two views are opposed, binary opposites which are incompatible. This difference is hugely troublesome in terms of how a human rights is defined and implemented. The universalist view rights as an inherent and available to all human beings, while the second view begs the question of inherent rights. It suggested that rights are functions of culturally specific contexts that determine their social use. The relativists view rights in a response to complicated scenarios in which different rights come to play against each other. A good example can be the rights of a local community, which has developed over centuries of unquestioned cultural traditions and practices, sometimes even religious practices, which may be opposed to the rights of the newcomers to that particular community who questions the practices. So, if you have to define human rights, then I would define human rights as encompassing an array of political, economic and social arenas, while defining the needs would also present a set of individual rights that apply worldwide. The following is the general definition of human rights offered by the United Nations in 1978 in quotes. Human rights are those rights which are inherent in our nature and without which we cannot live as human beings. Human rights and fundamental freedoms allow us to fully develop and use our human qualities, our intelligence, our talents and our conscience to satisfy our spiritual and other needs. In this definition, inherent right would refer to allocating of resources and constructing policies by which human rights apply to all people equally and not simply to a selected group of individuals or individuals themselves. By classifying certain rights and freedoms as human rights, all governments recognize the common goal of creating conditions which would guarantee these rights and freedoms, despite the intricacies involved in actually ensuring that they are granted. Another issue related to the definition of human rights which we have defined earlier, is that it emphasizes on the rights of individuals. To overcome what appears to be a contradiction of human rights principles, the logical solution would be to accept that everyone shares a common humanity, and that regardless of circumstances, every individual would be entitled to live according to basic human right principles. The best known histories of human rights movement world over tend to begin with ancient religions and societies, and they feature the evolution of the concepts and institutions of human rights. And that concepts of institutions and human rights would run across civilizations. The roots of the notion of how human rights originated and what it would mean can be drawn as far back as the Greeks, who devised the role of individuals in managing the civic affairs of the states, or rather the city states. The idea of civil and political rights stems from liberal freedoms advocated by John Stuart Mill and other utilitarian philosophers. The concepts of economic, social and cultural rights can be traced back to Hegel, who wrote the Elements of Philosophy of the Right. The origin of modern day positive rights in international law may be traced to the creation of International Labour Organization, or the ILO, in 1919, which should be seen as the Western response to the socialist ideology of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, if we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the key starting point in understanding of human rights in the UDHR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the United Nations made in 1948 and has been approved by almost every member nation of the United Nations. This declaration provides a list of specific human rights, but then again you should remember that it is not legally binding on any nation. However, at the very least, a nation's approval of the UDHR would indicate its commitment to satisfying the rights specific mentioned in the document of UDHR. The Universal Declaration therefore contains 4 distinct sets of human rights. The first one is the negative human rights, the second one is the positive human rights, the third one is collective human rights, and the fourth one, that is more of a recent origin, is the subjective rights. Now, to begin with, negative human rights, which follow mainly from the Anglo-American legal tradition, denotes action that a government should not take, which means the state would not interfere in human life. These are codified in the United States Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and includes such freedoms as freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. The second one, that is the positive human rights, follow mainly from the utilitarian and the socialist inspired continental European legal traditions, which denotes rights as to include the state's obligation to protect and provide for its citizens. Examples of such rights would include right to education, right to livelihood, a right to health care, and legal equality. Positive rights have been codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many of the 20th century constitutions as well. Thirdly, the collective human rights is a categorization offered by Karel Wasik, and it speaks of 3 generations of human rights. The first generation, which consisted of civil and political rights and included the right to life and political participation, etc. The second generation consisted of economic, social and cultural rights and included such rights as right to subsistence and right to livelihood, etc. The third generation, which was called the solidarity rights, included rights which individuals and people are entitled on the basis of equality and non-discrimination, and the right to participate meaningfully in a social and international order. Examples of the solidarity rights would include right to peace, right to clean environment, right to development, etc. Out of all the 3 generations, the third generation is the most debated one, since it lacks both legal and political recognition. Some scholars have suggested a fourth right, which is called the subjective rights, and they are so called because they are related to the future generations as well as rights that cannot belong to an individual nor to a social group, including nations. These rights belong only to humanity as a whole. Examples can be rights leading from genetic engineering, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization, eugenics, etc. These rights have generated legal complications and ethical as well as religious complications and issues. Some theorists discredit these divisions by claiming that rights are interconnected. Arguably, for example, basic education is necessary for the rights to participation of the individuals. Therefore, there are 2 classical positions which I would like to discuss here regarding human rights. The first one is that human rights are universal. This conception of rights places the protection of independent individual at the center, and the individual is assumed to be self-sufficient entity. It follows that this is the only possible conception of human rights. This set of rights has been determined. Either you accept these rights or not. Rights, therefore, bring with them a degree of finality and imposition. The second is that human rights are culturally relative. This position advocates that each and every culture has its own notion of human rights and freedoms. Human rights can only exist by reverting back to cultural norms and not looking to external. Here I would mean external as Western legal documents. Each group should look to their own culture to devise and implement their own notion of rights. Employing the concept of universality of rights or using the available international instruments is a form of cultural imperialism. These are representations of extreme universality and cultural relativist positions. Each position tries to make its case by indicting the other position. For universality, talking about culture would endanger human rights by allowing cultures that have harmful practices and would dilute the notion of rights. For a relativist, allowing the notion of universalism is accepting alien values and Western imperialism. One of the most pertinent issues in the past years has been the conflict between two different ideologies of human rights on a national scale: universalism and cultural relativism. Universalism holds that more primitive cultures would eventually evolve to have some of the system of law and rights as those existing in the Western cultures. However, cultural relativists hold an opposite view, and their views are similarly rigid and unchangeable. And their viewpoint is that a traditional culture is unchangeable. There is no simple alternative to letting individual countries enforce human rights. For a major obstacle to impose a universal enforcement is that of cultural relativism, which makes the application of human rights a kind of balancing act between the universalists and the cultural relativists. Notions of what human rights is would depend upon how balanced the idea is between the universalists and the cultural relativists. This contradiction is an interesting area of study, that the founding principle which sees human rights as universal, an individual culture that defines their own values and ethics, needs to be analyzed and studied. Applying human rights universally without differences to specific cultural principles actually would diminish a nation's cultural identity, which in itself is a human rights violation. Thank you.